So, I'm about to analyze an episode of Bluey called Sleepytime. If you haven't seen Bluey, watch it. It's amazing. In particular, this episode is considered masterpiece material. It's free to watch on YouTube, so I invite you to do so. On IMDb, the episode ranks as a 9.8 out of 10, and it sits at number 22 on the list of highest rated TV episodes of all time. I mean, just look at some of these reviews. When I told my girlfriend I was doing a video on Sleepytime, she said, "Oh, is that the one that makes everybody cry?" This episode is genuinely considered magnum opus level material by viewers, and I hope my analysis sheds some light on why. Moreover, I want this to be a lesson in how we understand symbolism as readers. In his book, How to Read Literature Like a Professor, Thomas C. Foster spends a good portion of his chapters on symbolism and allusions. He points out that almost all texts can, in some way, be connected back to Shakespeare, the Bible, and/or Greek mythology. But in the book's interlude, Did He Mean That?, Foster explains that with all these symbols and allusions, students inevitably ask, does the author intend to do that? His answer is always, yes, but he's being coy. He knows that answer is misleading. But the fact is, it doesn't matter. As he later explains in the interlude, in his creative writing classes, students frequently bring in biblical parallels, classical or Shakespearean allusions, bits of REM songs, fairy tale fragments, anything you can think of. It's a great deal of what makes reading interesting and fun. And in his chapter titled, Is That a Symbol?, Foster answers, of course it is, but students of course ask what the symbol means. Foster responds, quote, I usually come back with something clever like, well, what do you think? Everyone thinks I'm either being a wise guy or ducking responsibility, but neither is the case. Seriously, what do you think it stands for? Because that's probably what it does. At least for you. End quote. That is to say, attempting to decode symbols isn't a checklist, but a personal action. We can't twist the author's words, but we can imagine. Foster concludes the chapter by writing, a reader's imagination is the act of one creative intelligence engaging another. So engage that other creative intelligence. Listen to your instincts. Pay attention to what you feel about the text. It probably means something. I hope you understand what I'm getting at here. While I am attempting to decode the meaning in Bluey's Sleepytime, I'm not saying that every symbol I decode is what the author intended. That shouldn't matter. So join me as we analyze Sleepytime. In an act of efficient storytelling, the episode's very first lines give an indication of the meaning behind the episode, and later the symbolism. Chili says, and then the baby chick hatched out of her egg, and the first thing she saw was her mummy chicken. Yes, this episode is primarily about motherhood, and more broadly, parenthood. Chili then reads another book with Bingo, one about the solar system. Chili hands Bingo her stuffed bunny, Floppy. Then Bingo states her goal for this story. I want to do a big girl sleep tonight and wake up in my own bed. Chili tells her to just do her best and reminds her, quote, I'm always here if you need me. This statement will be important later. It's in the transitioning scene that we realize the majority of this episode takes place inside Bingo's dream. Dreams are common symbols in literature, usually denoting a character's wants and/or fears. Using dreams as a storytelling or literary device is often frowned upon because it's easy for the dream to have no weight on the story's outer workings. You might remember not too long ago, pretty much every fan theory forum included the theory, what if the main character was in a coma? Theories like these quickly fell out of vogue because, even if true, such theories have no larger implications on the story as a whole. Bluey circumvents the potential laziness of the trope in two ways. First, we see that the events of Bingo's dream run parallel to real-life happenings. Second, and more importantly, Bingo's dream gives her major character development. So while the dream itself doesn't technically have weight in the real world, the development it gives Bingo does. It's okay for events to happen in a character's mind so long as the events impact the character or story in a way that leads to meaningful change. Bingo's dream begins rather shockingly as she shatters the earth from the inside. On a cosmic scale, it's almost kind of terrifying. It's reminiscent of the T.S. Eliot quote, "This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper." However, upon closer inspection, this is not the end of the world. The Earth in Bingo's dream is not the Earth as we know it, it's merely a representation of Bingo's world. She hatched from her world just as the chick in her book hatched from its egg. It's almost heavy-handed, but the message is clear. Bingo's world is shattering. She's changing as she grows up. Bingo takes Floppy, who hatched from the moon. Bluey, meanwhile, hatched from Venus. In the real world, she visited her parents' bedroom to ask for water. When Chili returns with the water, Bluey has taken her spot on the bed, so Chili leaves and goes to sleep in Bluey's bed. Bingo sleepwalks and finds a large blue planet to play on, the real-world parallel to the sheets between Bluey and their dad, Bandit. When Bluey and Bandit pull on the sheets, Bingo is launched into the air. In her dream, she confronts Jupiter, whose real-world parallel is Bandit. Jupiter, or Zeus as he's known in Greek mythology, is the father of the gods. But beyond the fatherhood status, the link between Jupiter and Bandit seems tenuous at best. Zeus is a cruel despot, after all. Bandit is anything but cruel. And this is the first point where we have to mention the music. Bluey is known for using classical music in its scoring, and this episode is no different. Fittingly, the track accompanying this episode is a rendition of Jupiter, the Bringer of Jollity. It's a movement from Gustav Holst's orchestral suite, The Planets. Jupiter is arguably the most famous movement from the suite, and its main tune has been used in other songs, including another song written by Holst. The movement's title is a bit perplexing, especially compared to the movements that come before it. Mars, the Bringer of War, Venus, the Bringer of Peace, and Mercury, the Winged Messenger. Those adjectives sound like accurate descriptors of their gods, but Jollity as a descriptor for Jupiter? We don't have all the details, but Holst's biographer, Michael Short, speculated that some of the characteristics attributed to the planets were taken from Alan Leo's booklet, What is a Horoscope? But more importantly, according to Short, Holst's only criterion was that of maximum musical effectiveness. When it came to Jupiter, Short pointed out that Holst used buoyant and exuberant music to depict Jupiter's abundance of life and vitality. Moreover, those born under Jupiter are often prescribed the traits of nobility and generosity. The middle section of Holst's movement embodies nobility, and those who have seen Bluey would almost certainly agree that Bandit is noble, generous, and abounding with life and vitality. Holst, through music, created a unique subversion of the typical symbolistic tendencies we see in Jupiter, and Bluey does the same thing. One would expect Jupiter to be dangerous, rough, and imposing, but when Bingo approaches Jupiter, it's with wonder. She gets closer and begins pawing at the surface, which unexpectedly has a smooth, whipped consistency like a frosting. That is to say, Jupiter, Bandit, is made of sweet components. And even as Bingo continues to smack, even as she and Bluey start stomping on their father, even when Bingo kicks him in the groin, he doesn't lose his temper upon waking up. Also, notably, when Bingo does kick her father between the legs, in her dream, she envisions herself jumping into the Great Red Spot, or the eye of Jupiter's storm. Again, we see a subversion here since this space would be extremely dangerous in reality. But when Bingo enters the Great Red Spot, it's almost as if she goes into a prenatal state. Just look at the imagery here. Once there, she and Floppy both relax. Notice as well, very briefly, there appear to be flashes of lightning around Bingo, but she remains unbothered and unworried. She doesn't even seem to notice them at all. The symbols at play here, on the inside and outside of Jupiter, are those we would typically associate with motherhood, but it's very clear that Jupiter is Bandit, the father of the house. What's being shown to us here is meant to denote that child rearing is not purely a woman's job, and there's no shame in a man having traits that are seen as traditionally motherly. If we want to pull that thread further, we might say that blurring the lines between gender roles in parental relationships is a good thing. Bandit shows his nature when he carries Bingo and Floppy back to bed. On his way back, he finds Bluey on the toilet and sings to her at her request. Meanwhile, Bingo sleepwalks back to her parents' bed once more. Bingo takes the other side of the bed, and Bandit again shows his charitable nature by electing to sleep on the floor. When Bluey falls off the bed, Bingo realizes in her dream that she and Floppy are alone. The two sit on a small planet and shiver. However, Bingo and Floppy are soon distracted from the situation as they see sunlight breaking through the planet's orbits. They start to make their way toward the sun, and in real life, Bingo is sleepwalking back to her bed. On their way to the sun, they pass Saturn, discovering the ring is made up of flying bunnies just like Floppy. The bunny wants to join her kind, and that saddens Bingo, but she soon smiles, hugs her bunny, and lets her go. This portion of the story is an important look into Bingo's character development. In literature and media, toys are common symbols of childhood innocence or other fond attachments, and leaving those toys is a symbol of maturation, like in Toy Story 3. Perhaps the most famous example of this use of symbolism is in The House at Pooh Corner. The final story, in which Christopher Robin and Pooh come to an enchanted place and we leave them there, presents Christopher Robin's animal friends signing a poem from Eeyore. Each friend slowly departs until just Pooh and Christopher Robin remain. The boy informs his bear that he can't do nothing anymore, but hopes that Pooh will come to the enchanted place by himself even after Christopher Robin has gone. It's a poignant metaphor for growing up, and Bingo's decision to let Floppy go shows her willingness to grow up as well. But despite her willingness, her reaction shows it's still hard for her to do. Initially, it would seem there's a sad quality to growing up, a need to leave certain things behind at the risk of being lonely. Luckily, Bingo's never truly on her own. We'll revisit this sequence in just a moment. Bingo begins crying in the dream and in real life. Chili, who's sleeping in Bluey's bed, wakes up and makes her way to her daughter. In Bingo's dream, a meteoroid flies her to Mercury, where she sits face to face with the sun. In real life, Chili and Bingo are snuggling together. Yes, Chili is symbolized by the sun. And much like with bandits tied to Jupiter, there's a lot of clever subversion going on here. For one thing, the sun often represents male deity figures, with the moon as a frequent female counterpart. The sun as a deity is perhaps no more obvious than in its relationship to the Christian God. For centuries, writers have played on the words sun, S-U-N, and son, S-O-N, as in the Son of God, Jesus Christ. Moreover, the sun is a bringer of life and light, and the celestial body is at the center of the solar system, a parallel to Christ at the center of the universe, for theologian writers. Moreover, the literal Bible makes the parallel multiple times. Like in Psalm 84:11, the King James Version reads, "For the Lord God is a sun and shield. The Lord will give grace and glory. No good thing will he withhold from them that walk uprightly." We also once again have to take into account the music. We hear the middle section of Holst's Jupiter movement playing in all its glory. There's more than one way to interpret this. For one thing, we can read this as Bandit's influence still being present even when Chili and Bingo are alone together. Since this is Jupiter's movement, and we already established that Bandit is Jupiter, that would make sense. However, remember that Holst used this section of Jupiter again after composing the Planets Suite. This section of the suite gained so much notoriety that Holst gave it a name unto itself, Thaxted. He used Thaxted in a hymn called I Vow to Thee My Country. Thaxted has also been used in several hymns since, including O God Beyond All Praising and For the Splendor of Creation, which Harvard uses in its commencement ceremonies. All that is to say, there is a mystique of godliness in this instance where Bingo views her mother as the sun. But make no mistake, the symbolism doesn't intend to prop up Christianity or any other deity. It's easy to make that mistake in literature. We see religiously charged language and we jump to the conclusion that the work is pro-religion. Like in Percy Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, we see words like wild spirit, destroyer and preserver, heaven and prayer, and we know to associate those terms with religion. With the added context of Percy's son passing away shortly before this poem was written, it's easy to misread this as Percy's come to God moment. But that's not what it is. Percy was a staunch atheist. His religiously charged language was meant to convey the godlike power of nature. For Percy, nature was his god, the destroyer and preserver. Similarly, Bluey is using the religiously charged symbolism to suggest that something here is godlike, that something being the love of a mother. That symbol is further confirmed when Chili, as the sun, says, "Remember, I'll always be here for you, even if you can't see me, because I love you." Much like the sun's light, the love of the Christian God is omnipresent. As it says in Matthew 5:45, "He maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good." Similarly, a good mother's love is like that of a god, or like the sun's ever-burning light. Even when the sun's light isn't visible, we know it's there, just like pure love. The Christian Bible also makes this parallel, that the love of God is comparable to the love of a mother. In Luke 13:34, the King James Version, Jesus says, "How often would I have gathered thy children together as a hen doth gather her brood under her wings?" Interesting that God compares himself to a hen, an explicitly female figure. Or in 1 John 5:6, This is he that came by water and blood, even Jesus Christ, not by water only, but by water and blood. I.e., Jesus Christ was born to a mother by water and blood, and similarly, he would later give his water and blood for mankind. Motherhood is an expiatory experience. A mother makes a sacrifice for her children, gives her life for her children, like the Christian God. Though it's not as prominent as Bingo's arc, there is another arc at play in this story, Chili's. Chili is making a conscious effort to let her daughter grow up. She's willing to let Bingo go despite the sacrifice she's already made for her. This is shown when Chili leaves Bingo to sleep on her own. Bingo parallels this arc with Floppy. She lets Floppy be with her own kind because she knows that's what's best for her. Letting a child go is perhaps the biggest sacrifice a parent can make. But for Bingo, we see that sacrifice come back around, as Floppy and her friends help to reform her world. Even though she let Floppy go, the stuffed rabbit is still a part of her world. Bingo realizes that being a big girl doesn't mean doing things entirely on her own, and to that point, who brought Floppy back to Bingo? Chili. We see how this circle of parental love and self-fulfillment continues. It's self-sustaining through the purity of the love on display. And as far as Bingo knows, she had a big girl sleep in her own bed just as she wanted. Of course, she had a little help, and that's okay. It's good that Bingo gets to grow up at her own rate. The episode ends with brief flashes that remind the audience of the parental sacrifices made that night. The bathroom where Bandit sang to Bluey, the water that Chili retrieved for her, Bandit and Bluey cuddled together on the floor despite the beating he received earlier, Chili asleep in her bed after running around all night, and the book that she read to Bingo just before sleepy time. And of course, the episode closes out with a shot of Bingo and Floppy doing a big girl sleep with the sun rising in the background while Thaxted plays in all its glory. It still gives me chills, no matter how many times I watch it. Perhaps you think I've read too much into this. Let me remind you, my intention was never to guess what the writers were thinking when they made this episode. For some of you watching, you might think this exercise was futile as a result, and this is where I want to briefly discuss blue curtains. Starting around 2014 and up to the present, you may have seen variations of this meme, one where a teacher asks their students why the curtains are blue in a text the class is reading. The students always presume the curtains are blue for no reason, and that it was an arbitrary choice on the author's part. I cannot describe how much I hate this meme, and I'm not the only one. For one thing, authorial intent isn't everything, and English classes don't exist for you to learn what some author thinks. No good teacher will teach you what to think. A good teacher teaches how to think. So, when an English teacher asks a question such as, "What do you make of this?" they're not necessarily expecting a right answer, they're expecting you to engage in critical thinking. You can find subtext even where the authors didn't intend it. And if you think the more interesting argument is to say authorial intent does matter, then okay, please make that argument, but do it critically. I love this episode of Bluey, and I know I'm not the only one in that regard. With this exercise, I wasn't so much concerned with being right. I was concerned with engaging with the text in a meaningful way. And if you think everything I've said here is bullcrap, then please, engage with me and with the text. I invite you to argue with me respectfully. Posit your reading for this episode, or tell me what you thought of my analysis. Tell me everything. And keep in mind, ultimately, this is a rough draft.